Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about Washington's term in office as president and what he is doing to head the new government. So imagine the situation we're in right now, okay? So Washington has just been the president of the Constitutional Convention. He is very well respected by pretty much everybody in the United States, and he has been elected unanimously the very first president of a brand new country, right? So can you imagine what Washington was really thinking when he became president and what that might have been like? Well, I have a good idea of what he might have been thinking. I think that he was thinking, what the heck am I doing, right? When George Washington becomes president, it's not really super clear what his job is going to be, what he's going to do, and how this is going to change the country. So when we talk about Washington, we talk about a president who made precedent, right? And when we talk about precedent, that means you are the first person to do something, right? And people who come after you are going to make the same decisions that you're going to do, right? So that's what George Washington is really going to be doing as president. So he basically has one job, right? His job is to take this document, the Constitution, and try and figure out what this new and, quite frankly, unstable government is going to look like. So I want you to look at this document here, okay? This document has 7 articles in it without the Bill of Rights, right? This is Article 1. Article 1's pretty long. It basically covers the whole first column. This is all about Congress and the legislative branch. So here's the thing. Most of the founders who wrote the Declaration or who wrote the Constitution, they knew how a legislature worked. A lot of them had served in state legislatures or had worked even for the British government, the older ones, right? They knew what a legislature was supposed to do, what it was supposed to look like, how it was supposed to be set up. That was their thing, right? Then we move on to Article 2. This over here is Article 2. It's a lot shorter than Article 1, right? So this Article 2 over here, this is about the president. So they knew what they didn't want the president to do, but they weren't really sure what right the president actually did have to do things, right? Then we move on to Article 3. Article 3 is about the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. That's this part right here. It's a lot shorter, right? So here's the thing about the judicial branch. They didn't really know much about what a court system was supposed to look like and what they were going to do. So Washington, as president, had to take his pen and the Constitution and figure out what is it that these different branches can actually do. He has to fill in things. Maybe he takes his eraser and takes some things out, right? And adds a little bit of notation here and there. His job is to figure out, what is this document really going to mean for our government? So the very first thing that he wants to do, right, is appoint judges. That is one of the roles of the president, is to appoint the judges of the Supreme Court. So this is the first section of Article 3. Let's read this together. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall at stated times receive for their service a compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. All right. So, what does this mean? It actually doesn't mean a whole lot. It means that we're going to have a Supreme Court, and if Congress feels like establishing courts below the Supreme Court, they can, and they're going to have the same salary the whole time they're in office. That doesn't tell me a whole lot, right? In fact, there's a pretty important thing that doesn't tell me. It says that the judicial power shall be held in the one Supreme Court, but how many judges are going to be in it? Well, there's nothing in here that says this. Wait a minute, maybe let's look at the rest of it. Yeah, no, nothing. There's nothing in here that says how many judges are supposed to be on the Supreme Court. Well, that's awkward. So George Washington, his first job as president is to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. How many does he appoint? He didn't know either. So the very first thing he has to do is actually figure out how many judges he's going to appoint. So he gets Congress to pass the Judiciary Act of 1789. And the whole goal of this act is to basically clarify the federal court system. What is the job of the federal court? And it is because Article 3 is super, super vague, right? They were kind of, when they wrote Article 3, they were kind of like, we'll just figure this part out later. We don't really know about this. So yeah, there's going to be a Supreme Court. Done. Kind of like when you do your homework sometimes and you kind of like BS your homework because you don't really know. That's Article 3. That's the Founding Fathers BSing the Supreme Court, right? So Article 3 is super big. They need to clarify it. So Washington says, all right, well, we got to set up how many Supreme Court justices we're going to have. So he sets up a Supreme Court with 5 justices and 1 Chief Justice. Now, you may notice a problem with this number. There are 6 of them. What does that mean can happen if half of them vote one way and half of them vote another way? We've got a tie, right? It makes more sense to have an odd number. We now have 9 on the Supreme Court, so there is 1 judge who can break that tie, right? But at least it's better than nothing. He also sets up 16 lower, or those inferior federal courts. Basically, their job is to filter things up. Not everything has to go right to the Supreme Court, so they're going to filter it up a little bit so they can kind of get through some of those court cases. Next thing he do is he looks back at Article 2, right? All right. So Article 2 tells me a little bit more about my job, right? Right over here. But I still need some help, right? I'm president, but I don't know everything. George Washington's a general, right? He's a really good general. But he's not a treasurer. He doesn't deal with foreign nations. So the next thing that he's got to do is actually appoint a cabinet, appoint a group of men whose job it is to advise him and help them run the government, right? So there's nothing in here that says the president appoints a cabinet. But that's the most important thing that a president does when he's in office, is figure out who's going to work with him as president, right? And so these guys are, in theory, experts in their field. Their job is to basically make sure that whatever their job is to run that department smoothly. The cabinet is really fluid. It changes throughout history. So, positions have been added and taken away as needed in our country. For example, when 9/11 happened, George Bush added the Department of Homeland Security and appointed a Secretary of Homeland Security. So that was a new cabinet position. In the 70s, they added an environmental position to the cabinet. So the cabinet is something that changes a lot. And when Washington appointed his cabinet, he only really needed 3 guys to help him out, okay? So the first is the Department of War. So the Department of War, their job is to oversee national defense, right? Washington's the commander-in-chief, but that's not all he can spend his time doing. He's got a big job, right? So the job of Henry Knox, who is going to be the secretary he appoints, is to oversee defense, right? We actually saw Henry Knox in the John Adams video. He was the big guy on the horse that had the cannons. He was a major officer in the American Revolution. Perfect guy to choose for this job. The next department is the Department of State. The whole point of the Department of State is to deal with our foreign relations with other nations. So Washington appoints this guy. You might recognize him. That's Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson had actually been a minister to Paris and lived in France for a while during the American Revolution. So he was really good at knowing how to deal with foreign governments and working really nicely with them and kind of making nice with foreign governments. So that was kind of his role, is to work with other nations and deal with any issues that might come up with that. The last one he has is the Department of the Treasury. So for the Department of the Treasury, your job is to handle the nation's finances, deal with money and where we're spending our money and how we're going to get rid of the national debt and how we're going to pay off things. And so Washington appoints a young guy named Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is from New York. He actually had a really big say in the Constitutional Convention. He is, in fact, the only person from New York to have signed the Constitution. And Alexander Hamilton had a lot of political power. He was too young to fight in the war, but he had a lot of political power in his day, and he's going to play a really major role in influencing Washington's decision-making. If Alexander Hamilton looks familiar to you, it's probably because you have seen him here, right? He is currently on the $10 bill, and he was never president. In fact, he's not even qualified to be president because he was not born in the continental United States. He was born in the Caribbean. But he is so important to handling the Treasury in the United States that we put him on a Treasury note. $10 bill. So we have a lot of economic problems when we start our new country. We just fought this major war. We spent some time under the Articles, but it wasn't going so well. So there's a lot of economic issues. Basically, the main economic problem is we are in debt both to foreign nations and all of the people who bought bonds from the United States during the war. So a bond is something, it's kind of like a loan you give to the government, or you say, okay, I'm going to give the government, I'm going to buy a $20 war bond, okay? And so in 10 years, I can cash that back in and get my $20 back. Or I can wait 20 years and I'll get back some interest on it. So I might get like $25. In 20 years, I might get like $35, right? So the idea here is that you loan money to the government and eventually they can pay you back with interest when you cash in your bond. The problem is we don't have money. So how are we going to pay these guys back, right? Like that's a major problem, right? Especially once foreign nations come knocking on our door and they're like, hi, yeah, it's time to pay your debt, right? Like you can't pay for you can't buy stuff on a credit card if you don't have the money to pay for it. That's basically what's happening. So how are we going to do that? Another problem is that there are some states who are also in debt to foreign nations. So under the Articles of Confederation, states were borrowing money from foreign nations. So we have like Rhode Island or Massachusetts who's in debt to like the Netherlands. Super weird, right? But now that we're part of the United States, how are we going to make the states pay for those debts? Like that's not something they can do now. States under the Constitution can't borrow money from other nations, but they still owe this money. So how are they going to pay their money back? Finally, when we tax people, where are we going to tax them? Where are we going to print our money? Right? These are big questions. It's a big part of how we're going to run our government. So Hamilton comes up with a plan to try and kind of answer some of these questions. The last question is, of course, what are we going to tax? How are we going to raise the money, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different parts of Hamilton's economic plan here really quickly. We'll go through it a little bit more in depth in class. But basically what we've got is the first thing he says is the federal government is going to try and pay off those foreign debts by reissuing bonds to holders. So basically the idea is we pay off our foreign debts by selling bonds back and saying, hey, like, give us a few more years, we will get you, but we got to pay off our foreign debts first, right? Makes sense, right? Also, his idea was that the federal government would assume or take over the state debts, right? So basically, if Rhode Island was in debt to the Netherlands, then the United States government would assume that debt, would take that debt on themselves. So Rhode Island wouldn't be responsible for paying it back. The federal government would pay it back, okay? The next thing that we're going to do is establish a national bank. So this is going to be the Bank of the United States, and its job is to basically hold all the money, right? Print money, that's another big part of it, and be kind of the bank that regulates currency, regulates money in the United States. We're going to raise taxes on imported goods. This is called a tariff, okay? Know this word, tariff, a tax on goods that we are importing. The point of a tariff is to make domestic goods cheaper, right? So let's imagine you go to the grocery store and you've got a mustard that's made in the United States and you've got a mustard that's made in Great Britain, okay? Let's say it takes the exact same amount of money to make each of these mustards, but the mustard from Great Britain has a tariff on it that Britain had to pay, right? So that means that the price of that mustard is going to go up. So when you're looking at these two mustards sitting on a shelf, the American mustard might be $3 and the British mustard might be $6. Exact same mustard, right? Which one are you going to buy? Well, you're going to buy the $3 mustard, right? So you buy American goods, and if you do buy foreign goods, the foreign goods are going to be, or when foreign goods are shipped into the United States, British government will pay a tax on those goods, right? So that's a really good way to raise money from trade. The last thing he says is we're going to put an excise tax or a sales tax, essentially, on whiskey. So what's that going to do to the price of whiskey? It's going to make it go up, right? People want their whiskey, so this is going to be a pretty controversial tax, right? So how are we going to make people actually pay this? This is a very, very controversial idea, this whole plan. And so the South particularly is not on board with this plan. They have a lot of issues. They think that it makes the government way too strong. They think that it makes the government have way too much control. So they kind of cut a deal with the South. They kind of bribed them. They say, we need a new capital, right? We can't be, New York City was the capital for a while. That's actually where Washington lived. It was in New York City. And he says, New York City can't be the capital forever. Let's have a new district that's going to be just the capital of the United States, right? Great. D.C., Washington, District of Columbia, right? Washington, D.C. So the nation's capital is moved to Northern Virginia from New York. And basically, this was seen as kind of a bribe for the South to support the economic plan. Like, we'll give you the country's capital if you support the economic plan. It worked for some people, but not for everybody, okay? But like I said, a lot of people are really uncomfortable with parts of this tax, particularly the tax on whiskey. So in Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of corn being grown, and corn is the main ingredient for making whiskey, there is a revolt of Pennsylvania farmers against the whiskey tax. Okay, this is known as the Whiskey Rebellion. So let's think about this. It's 1789. 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was signed. A lot of these guys, if they were not themselves Revolutionary War veterans, had dads who were, right? What was the Revolutionary War about? It was about a tax, right? So the American people knew if they didn't like a tax, what did they do? They started a rebellion, right? And it worked for the American Revolution. It worked for Daniel Shays under the Articles of Confederation. Why wouldn't it work now, right? So what do you think happened? Do you think it worked? Well, it actually didn't, because Washington, the commander-in-chief, sends 10,000 men to smush it, right? We want to get rid of this. And of course, you can imagine these guys who might be Revolutionary War vets, like they see their commander-in-chief, George Washington, popular guy, they see him coming up on horseback and they're like, nah, man, JK, we going back home now. Our bad, we'll pay the tax, right? We'll see you. Bye. And this shows that the federal government, first of all, will crack down on lawlessness, but also that it can. Because remember, that was the whole point of Daniel Shays' rebellion, is that it proved that the government couldn't do anything. So this rebellion shows that the federal government is much stronger than it had been before. And it's not going to put up with crap. Like, you going to pay your taxes. You got representation now, so you pay your taxes when we say you're going to pay your taxes, right? So that's what that's all about. So also at this time, we're going to have the foundation of the very first political parties. There are no political parties, right, when George Washington is elected. There's no Republicans, there's no Democrats, there's no nothing, right? Washington hated political parties. He himself did not ascribe to a political party because he really believed that political parties would split the nation, okay? He wasn't far off, let's be honest. But that doesn't mean that there are not going to be people who are going to disagree on topics, okay? So this is where we get, in one corner, Thomas Jefferson with the Democratic Republicans. In the other corner, Alexander Hamilton with the Federalists. Let's see how the political parties take place, okay? So here's 3 things you need to know about political parties before we get into them. First of all, they, like I said, Hamilton is the head of the Federalist Party. Jefferson's the head of the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans is not the same as the Democrats or the Republicans of today. Okay, so keep that in mind. Totally different political party. Basically, when these parties start to develop these 2 different factions, and Hamilton and Jefferson did not get along, and remember, they're both in the cabinet. Jefferson actually resigns at one point because he hates Hamilton. So at first, they're just different factions, but eventually they become actual political parties that people will ascribe to. But the problem is, this is not anticipated in the Constitution. It's going to cause a lot of problems, particularly for the election of the president, which we'll talk more about when we get to John Adams, because it's going to be a major problem in that election. But let's just take a look here at what these 2 political parties were all about and what was kind of going on in these 2 political parties. So the first issue is the issue of federalism. Who's going to have more power, the state governments or the national government? Alexander Hamilton, he almost believed that the president should be like a king. Like, he really believed in a strong national government. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was all about the state governments. He really thought that the states should be the ones that had the most power. He was actually a pretty big fan of the Articles of Confederation. He didn't really like the whole Constitution idea. So Hamilton and the Federalists, strong national government. Jefferson and the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, strong state government, right? Next issue, Who should have power in the government? Who's going to actually rule the government? Alexander Hamilton said it should be the educated elites, right? People who know what they're talking about, who've read, who are intelligent, maybe upper class, right? Like, we don't really want regular people to be in charge because, ew, right? Gross. Whereas Thomas Jefferson, even though he was an educated elite, he really thought that it should be the farmer, the common man, right? That is the foundation of America, is the people. And so the people should be the ones who kind of have the most say in government. That's kind of a weird idea in this time. Most people do not feel that way, right? Most people agree with Hamilton that it should be the educated elites. The next is how we actually interpret the Constitution. The Federalists say if it's not specifically stated, we can do it. Right? So if there is nothing in the Constitution that says you can choose a number of judges to appoint, you can add in, I'm appointing 6 judges, right? Now, Thomas Jefferson is not like that. If the Constitution does not give the federal specific powers, it's not the federal government's job. Whose job do you think he should be? If it's not the federal government, whose job does he think should have it? The states, right? So he believes in a strict interpretation. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. Right? If there's nothing in there about choosing the number of judges, it's not your job to choose a number of judges, right? So, like, he might not have been a fan of the whole Judiciary Act thing. This is actually going to be a big problem during his presidency because he's going to do something that's totally not in the Constitution at all. Way to go, Jefferson. Finally, we have the economic policy. Hamilton obviously supported Hamilton's economic plan, but it's important to remember that the other Federalists thought it was a good idea too, whereas Jefferson and the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, you'll also hear it just called the Republicans, totally opposed it, not cool with them, did not like it, gave the federal government way too much power, and that's not what they wanted. And then finally, we've got the people they actually supported. Right? So Hamilton and the Federalists were mostly Northerners, mostly like the East Coast elite, like the Harvard-educated people, manufacturers, people who made stuff, merchants, like people who sold stuff. For the most part, when it comes to which country they aligned their views with, they aligned closer to the British. Now, again, this is just after the American Revolution. It's not like they're buddy-buddy with the British, but if you're going to choose the British and the French, they're going to choose the British every time. Right? Whereas Jefferson and the Republicans were mostly Southerners or frontiersmen, like in Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion, those were frontier farmers, mostly the common people. They're going to favor the French. Now, 1789 is the same year that the French Revolution broke out, and the French Revolution is based on a lot of the same ideals of the American Revolution, and they really support that, okay? So that's going to be a big deal for these guys, all right? So that kind of just wraps up the beginning of this. We will go a little bit more in depth into some of these issues in class and what Washington was up to, but I just wanted to give you the basic overview of Washington's presidency and the political parties. So I will be seeing you soon. Bye.